here's some reprieve for motorists. Another round of oil price rollback will be implemented tomorrow.
Prices of diesel and kerosene will be going down by over 6 pesos per liter, while gasoline prices will be cheaper by 5 pesos and 70 centavos a liter.
A one-time decrease does not immediately result in prices of major commodities going down.
Problemado na ang mga lokal na panadero sa patuloy pong pagtaas ng presyo ng harina at maging asukal.
Sobrang nahihirapan po kami, lalo na po sa nangyayari po ngayon. Ngayong pagtaas, patuloy na pagtaas ng mga raw materials.
We show our displeasure by holding black flag, saying that the system that they are continuing for 74 years is depressive of our people, depressive of people's rights, human rights, and they were oppressive towards people, and they were just clinging on to power by using military forces. The youths were against this system.
From the nation's capital, all sides, all the time, I'm Robbie Alampay.
And I'm Sean Yao. The big story tonight.
A local agriculture group is urging President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. to declare a state of emergency.
They are pushing for this in order to cushion the impact of a looming global food crisis. In a television interview, Philippine Chamber of Agriculture and Food President Danilo Fausto said Marcos Jr. faces 3 major problems: declining agriculture productivity, depleting treasury, and the private sector's low confidence in expanding their businesses. Fausto explained that a state of emergency would allow the new administration to direct LGUs to set aside a portion of their revenues to improve agriculture production and avert growing food insecurity.
Here to talk to us some more about the impacts of the looming food crisis, we have with us live via Zoom PCAFI President Danilo Fausto and Ebon Foundation Executive Director Sunny Africa. Mr. Fausto, Mr. Africa, welcome to the big story.
Good evening, Sean. Good evening, Robbie.
Well, let me throw the question again, just so you can frame it for everyone. Is it time to declare a state of emergency?
Well, the reason why we're suggesting the state of emergency we declared is to give the president the flexibility to mobilize resources so that we can jumpstart the investment in agriculture for food production. We cannot wait for the disaster to come or the shortage to come before we act. You know, crops and livestock are being grown and fish are being grown. They have lives and it has to be done now because there are gestation period before you can harvest the crops, the livestock, and the fisheries. And we are shown that the treasury is now empty, and the one that is left now is just perhaps for salary of government employees, and the treasury has no money for development. So we need to give the president all the leeway possible so that he can mobilize funds and invest and help productivity. So that's why we are suggesting that measure.
Mr. Africa, we'd like to bring you in here. Of course, with the state of emergency, that will have the president being able to direct even local governments. What are the pros and cons of a state of emergency in the context not just of agriculture, but of everything that a cash-strapped government is facing?
Well, of course, the main pro of declaring any state of emergency is it gives the government extraordinary powers to deal with an extraordinary situation. So I think done properly, with full transparency and designed rationally, just giving the right powers, I think could always be a good thing to do in situations like this. The biggest con, I think, is what people already know. If part of the state of emergency gives powers in terms of too much flexibility, in terms of not following certain procedures and protocols, especially in finance, baka ma-formally tayo ulit. And I think the biggest problem with the state of emergency, if the powers are made too broadly, they're prone to abuse. And in some cases, I think we all have already seen that happening in the past, and that will defeat the whole point of state of emergency. Last point, I'm very worried that if we keep on using a state of emergency to deal with an extraordinary situation on a very short-term basis, that might actually give the government an escape hatch to actually address the long-term structural problem. So I do agree with Sir Danny about the need to give that kind of support. Pero sana it's not just a short-term thing. Let's deal with the problem now, not just with the immediate manifestation of the problem, but I think deal with the long-term solutions. And I think that's one possible con, fixating on the short term at the expense of the long term.
All right. While we're talking about short-term and long-term, in the latter days of President Duterte's administration, then Agriculture Secretary William Dar said that the food crisis, at least here in the Philippines, will be felt by the second half. We're already there. When we're talking about leeway or a gestation period, like Sir Sonny said, how long do we have really?
For crops, especially rice and corn will be harvested sometime August and September. And this is a rainy season. They need dryers so that they can support the 7-month requirement before they harvest again sometime in March and April. For rice, we are now have transplanted in Nueva Ecija, and we are already applying fertilizers. It might not be, we might have time to give the subsidy now, but what we are suggesting is that we have a triple cropping if that's for those areas that is feasible, so that in order to have more production of the land. And the triple cropping is what we have recommended to the President, just like what they're doing in Vietnam and in Thailand. And as you see, 19.9 million metric tons was harvested in 2021, and 75% of this are coming from irrigated areas. And so therefore, we can estimate about 15 million metric tons are coming from irrigated areas, and one cropping will give you 7.5 million metric tons. With 19.9 million plus 7.5 million, it will give about around 27 million metric tons of rice if that will be followed. And therefore, it will exceed the demand already because our requirement is something like 23 to 24 million only. And we're only assuming that the harvest or the yield per hectare is about 4.5 tons. There are high varieties of these rice varieties that can harvest 8 to 10 tons. That's why we are proposing Sagana 200, meaning 200 tons per hectare as the goal. We can reach 150 to 200, still better off, and we can meet the demand. For corn, we really need to have floor price and warehousing in order to make sure that everything that's harvested can be secure and be able to be made available. And for others like fisheries, we need fingerlings. And our commercial fishing is already dying, and therefore we need to go perhaps mariculture parks, and we can take care of fishes in cages in the ocean, in the sea, and increase our productivity in aquaculture. Because those that cannot, that are buying hogs or pork are shifting to fish, also chicken. Chicken have problems on hatching eggs because before last year, based on the report of our member by Tubra, they have imported the chicken hatching eggs. They imported about 15 million hatching eggs, and now they only have imported about over 700,000. And we will, without the chicks, we will not have chicken. So immediately, there's a need for intervention of government, and since there's no resources right now, because the budget for 2022 has been front-loaded by the Duterte administration, then the Marcos administration do not have the resources to mobilize for food production.
I mean, given that Mr. Africa and Mr. Fausto, where does that put government in terms of whatever options it still has in terms of importing?
I sort of want to jump in first. I think one important measure that should be in any emergency powers is actually setting price controls. I think there has been a long time problem with a lot of profiteering, hoarding, various sorts of price manipulation happening. We don't know yet if it's happening now, but I think it's something that the government can give more attention to. Because I think like Sir Danny said, using the financing method to try to resolve a food crisis, it takes time, I mean, kumbaga, nagutom na yung mga tao, then you wait like 3, 4, 5 months actually for a new harvest to actually improve. So I want to highlight, I think price controls should be considered as part of any emergency powers, because if you don't have that, the most we're going to get from just a mere financing approach to the emergency powers, we're getting a head start of maybe 6 months in the remainder of 2022, because the new budget comes in 2023 anyway. So I think we have to think beyond just the financing aspect. In terms of importation, again, that's always been a big problem for us, because the rice tariffication law, for instance, it affected so many rice farmers. On average, rice farmers lost about 12,000 pesos per hectare after rice tariffication. We have heard reports, we don't know how many, that many rice farmers have stopped rice farming because it wasn't productive enough for them anymore. So that approach of using importing to fill in a short-term gap that actually might have long-term consequences. So that's why I think we really should be tying in any short-term measures like price control, like increasing financing, like more support for agriculture right now. We really think it should be tied into a long-term strategy for protecting domestic agriculture, for supporting domestic agriculture. And one thing we do want to stress, domestic agriculture has fallen to its smallest share of the economy in the country's history, even before the pandemic. In 2019, it was just above 9%, and that's because of long-term government neglect. So I'm going to sort of go back full circle. Emergency powers, we always make a show of responding to an immediate crisis, and then, there's this big spectacle of taking action. But then when the crisis fades from media attention, the basic problems are still there. So we do want to think that it's best to fold it into a long-term structural approach to fixing the long-term problems of Philippine agriculture.
All right, we'll get back to this conversation in just a bit. In the meantime, join us in this conversation. Our big question tonight: how should the government deal with a looming food crisis?
Share your thoughts on our Facebook and YouTube live stream, or post a tweet with the hashtag #TheBigStory. We'll read some of your comments later on in the program. We'll continue our discussion with Philippine Chamber of Agriculture and Food President Danilo Fausto and Ebon Foundation Executive Director Sunny Africa after the break. Keep it here on One News, all sides, all the time.
Your thoughts on the Philippine peso, 17-year low at a time when oil prices are surging.
Well, good morning, Haslinda, and good morning, Rich. We economists don't talk of weak or strong peso. We talk of competitive currency. And so, as shown by David, the peso has depreciated together with other currencies, and in fact, we have depreciated much less than the other currencies. The weaker peso, or what we call depreciated peso, would mean, of course, higher oil bills, for example, and that because we are an oil importing country, but it also helps our exporters, make exports more competitive, helps our overseas Filipino workers. On the other hand, it imposes penalties on those who prefer, consumers who prefer imported goods, like what I call the Ferragamo crowd, right? And so it makes more expensive for them, and also for the travelers, Filipino travelers abroad. So there are winners and losers.
You're watching The Big Story here on One News.
Still joining us tonight, Ebon Foundation Executive Director, Sunny Africa, Philippine Chamber of Agriculture and Food President, Danilo Fausto. Mr. Africa, you want to talk about this? Alam ko, parang you keep saying, look, short term, sige, there's a crisis, let's talk about that, but let's not forget the long term, not only the long term looking forward, but all the decades of neglect that have led us to this situation, even prior to COVID. So, the President has said, no, one, he appointed himself Agriculture Secretary, but he also said, look, let's wait. July 25, first SONA, you will hear more details about our plan. Are you seeing plans in place? Are you, between him appointing himself as Agriculture Secretary, signaling the priority of agriculture here, initial statements, initial actions, are you seeing something consolidating to something that gives you an idea of the priority of this government for agriculture, but also more importantly, strategy?
Yeah, we're not seeing any action yet. We just hear, again, a lot of generalities. But one striking point, I think, is important from the President's assumption of the agriculture portfolio is his repeated use of the term self-sufficiency. Self-sufficiency is something that past administrations have not looked kindly upon. They've rather looked at food security instead of food self-sufficiency. And there's a huge difference. Food security means it's okay if you don't produce enough food as long as you can import it from Vietnam or Thailand. You sort of, you hope they don't have an export cartel. Food self-sufficiency means you aim for producing as much of your food consumed as possible domestically. I think that's a key point. And if President Marcos holds on to that notion of food self-sufficiency and then has the appropriate measures to do that, which will take a lot of resources. I mean, it's across the board from the farm inputs, the research and extension, to the infrastructure, to the marketing. I mean, it's a whole range of government interventions needed to get the same self-sufficiency that, for instance, Vietnam has. Hopefully, the use of that term was not a mistaken use of the term. If it was a genuine use of self-sufficiency, we think that's a very good direction. But of course, it remains to be seen if in the 2023 budget, we are going to be seeing the huge leaps in budgets needed for the Department of Agriculture, for Irrigation Authority, and for the whole range of agriculture agencies. And also if you're going to see a reversal from the trade liberalization, especially in rice, right now. If that happens by the SONA, I think that would be a big surprise and a very welcome surprise for us.
What about funding, sir? So if this can go to either one of you, or either one of you can answer this. Financing has always been a problem. It is, almost legendary that it's almost impossible to get loans from the land bank if you are even a medium farmer or a medium-scale farmer. What more, the small-time farmers out there, and how do we even begin to start to solve this issue with funding?
Well, if I may answer that, let's start with credit access. We have a Philippine Guarantee Corporation, and part of that Guarantee Corporation is the Agricultural Guarantee Loan Fund, which was folded in together with HGC and the Philippine. Now, the report of COA in 2020, 207 billion has been guaranteed by the Philippine Guarantee Corporation. Out of the 207 billion, more than 203 billion goes to real estate, benefiting big developers who do not need this guarantee in the first place. And agriculture got only 500 million out of the 207 billion. The problem of the farmers is that it is considered as a high risk by the banks, and we cannot blame the banks because they have a fiduciary function. But if the farmers are guaranteed by the government, then perhaps the banks will open up. There's about 1 trillion not released by banks, I think, under the Agri-Agra. Now, on the part of the local government units, there is this Mandanas-Garcia ruling that gives about more than 27% additional to their ERA. And the ERA of government, of the local government unit cannot be touch or the president has no authority to touch this because of the autonomous status of the local government units. And we want that portion of that Mandanas Garcia funding be directed to agricultural production by the local government units. And to do that, then perhaps government, the president might need emergency powers to do that. And perhaps also direct the implementation of what we propose is a mini agro-industrial centers in all barangays, in at least 10% of the 42,000 barangays, to provide value adding like rice dryer, rice miller, warehousing, and for fishing village, provide blast freezers, ice plants, and cold storage facilities, and perhaps even smoke oven machines. This will only cost about 2 million for small machines. And 2 million or 3 million, we are requesting the president to provide 3 to 5 million so that it will include refrigerated trucks to deliver. This all mini agro-industrial complex should be connected to the market, to the wholesalers, to the processors, and to the retailers, so that it will be a complete value chain. And perhaps we can securitize for future budget allocation next year. What we are afraid of now is that the Department of Budget and Management submitted to Congress, because they required 30 days before the opening of Congress to submit the proposed budget. And they submitted what President Duterte has approved. And that budget proposal even decreased the budget of the Department of Agriculture. I think from 85 went up to 75. And the president now is the secretary. We are hoping, and we are hopeful that come 2023, at least the budget of the Department of Agriculture will be doubled. And that will be next year. The problem now is this year. So we really have to mobilize funding for this year. I'd like to go with Sunny on the price control, but we have to calibrate this, because when you have price control, you prevent the profitability of producers and manufacturers, food processors. It might have an impact on expanding their investment. More than 95% of the agricultural output are from the private sector. We have to encourage them to expand and invest more. But if they are not making money, then it might be affecting their appetite to put in more investment in agriculture if they're not making money. So there has to be a calibration, because we understand that inflation is going up. We need to arrest inflation. And we cannot, at the moment, initially, we cannot stop the importation of things that we need because we really need the supply. But as we move along, the groundwork will have to be done to produce, because prices is a function of supply and demand. You increase the supply, and you decrease the demand, and then you decrease the prices. And the demand, we are asking all the Filipinos to reduce the consumption on rice. Puro kanin, only rice. We should stop this system. Because you eat food for nutrition, not because just for the sake of eating food. We need to make sure that even from the school level, from the elementary school level, students and children should be taught the proper way of eating good nutritious food. They can go to root crops, sweet potato, or other products, asaba, to replace wheat for bread, no? Because wheat, we cannot do anything because of the Ukraine war. There is a domino effect in terms of the supply chain disruptions and raw materials availability.
Mr. Fausto, unfortunately, we'll have to stop you there. We're running out of time, but we want to thank you for your time, for joining us tonight. That was Ebon Foundation Executive Director Sunny Africa and Mr. Fausto of PCAFI. Right after the break, frustration with the economic crisis boiled over in Sri Lanka as a huge crowd surged into the presidential palace. That and more when the big story returns. Keep it here on One News.
debt levels and the amount of fiscal space you had. I mean, does this concern you? And as incoming finance secretary, how will you address this? Because, you know, as a central banker, you did meet with various credit rating agencies. It's very important to have their confidence, isn't it?
Correct. It's to our credit that during the entire episode of the pandemic, the rating agencies have continued to affirm their investment-grade credit rating for the Philippines, despite the fact that there's a wave of downgrades for other developed and emerging economies. But going back to the debt issue, our debt to GDP ratio
You're still watching The Big Story here on One News. The entire world is closely watching developments in Sri Lanka as political chaos ensued from an economic meltdown. Here's what we know. Sri Lanka has been declared bankrupt by its own prime minister as it struggles with a severe foreign exchange shortage, leaving millions struggling to buy food, medicine, and fuel. This is the country's worst economic crisis since gaining independence in 1948. Inflation in Sri Lanka soared to a record high of 54.6% last month, and this is expected to hit 70% in the coming months. The financial crisis triggered months of largely peaceful anti-government protests, which escalated over the weekend when tens of thousands of protesters stormed the presidential palace and set fire to the prime minister's home. Due to intense pressure, Sri Lanka's president Gotabaya Rajapaksa escaped via a naval ship and vowed to resign on Wednesday. Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe has also expressed his willingness to resign.
How far is the Philippines from reaching the same economic situation as Sri Lanka? To discuss this, we have One News business editor Regina Lay joining us via Zoom. Reg, welcome to The Big Story.
Good evening, Robbie and Sean.
I mean, of course, Reg, everybody's following Sri Lanka. On the one hand, there's this obviously something extraordinary happening there. Literally running out of fuel, literally running out even of cooking oil for the population, 54% inflation. But what do people need to understand about the situation in Sri Lanka, and particularly how different it is from the Philippines?
Well, I guess the first thing I would say is don't panic. We have talked to economists about this, and they all say that, you know, there are at least 3 good reasons why the situation in Sri Lanka is, you know, far removed from us, and it's not going to happen here. The first very important reason is most of Sri Lanka's debt is to foreign creditors like China. Most of our debt is local. I think to the tune of about 70% or so, which means we're not at the mercy of foreign institutions or foreign countries, right? Number 2, because of years of mismanagement, Sri Lanka was left with hardly any foreign reserves. I think the last time I checked, it was just $25 million, if you can believe that, which means they can't afford to import food and fuel, as you pointed out, let alone pay the interest on their billions of dollars in loans, right? The Philippines, on the other hand, has more than $100 billion in reserves in the bank. That's worth about more than 8 months worth of our own imports. So we're covered for at least 8 months if, knock on wood, something happens, right? And the third important reason is that, look, the Philippine economy is just much bigger than Sri Lanka's. We have more exports. We have a thriving BPO industry, which brings in dollars. And most importantly, we have OFW remittances. Sri Lanka, of course, also exports its labor. They have overseas workers too, but it's a far smaller industry than in the Philippines. So I think the bottom line here is, I think when you talk about the situation in Sri Lanka happening to the Philippines, it's a bit of an apples to oranges comparison, Robbie.
Okay. All right, Reg, the Prime Minister and the President have both said they will be resigning, but what happens after that? I mean, where is Sri Lanka headed?
Sean, look, there's so much that they need to fix in the country. first they're going to have to install a new government, obviously one that will gain the people's trust back. We know that at this point the country is in talks with the IMF for a bailout. We'll see what comes of that. I think they need $60 billion just to survive the next several months. They're talking to countries like the US and Japan have also donated hundreds of millions of dollars in aid. Sri Lanka has also gone to India and China for some help as well. The Prime Minister, Wickremesinghe, also told AP that they will consider buying oil from Russia instead from now on, since Russia is selling it much cheaper now. So basically, the first thing that they need to do is clean up the house. First install a government, a new government that the people can trust, and then from there, one by one, pick up the pieces of the economy.
All right, thank you so much for your time and your insights. One News's business editor, Regina Lay. Thanks, Reg.
And that's the big story tonight. For more updates, follow News 5, the Philippine Star, and Business World online. You may also log on to onenews.ph for more in-depth analysis. I'm Robbie Alampay.
The big story is also available via Signal Play. Create a free account at signalplay.com and stream One News anytime, anywhere. I'm Sean Yao. Masks on, wash hands, and stay safe, Philippines.
We are One News, all sides, all the time.